The cardboard box dug into her hip, its corners softened by a dampness that was either her own sweat or the city's perpetual humidity. Chloe adjusted her grip, the coarse material scraping against the worn fabric of her dark green nurse scrubs. This was it. The last box. It was a pathetic testament to a life hastily dismantled, containing not treasured memories, but the functional debris of her existence. A worn-out stethoscope, a handful of medical textbooks, and a framed photograph of her mother she'd snatched from the wall in her flight. The hallway of the apartment building smelled of stale cigarette smoke and something vaguely like boiled cabbage, a scent that clung to the peeling, mustard-yellow paint. It was a world away from the sterile, lemon-scented corridors of the hospital, and a universe away from the pristine, glass-walled condo she had fled. But it was anonymous. It was safe. Or so she prayed. She fumbled with the key to apartment 3B, her hand trembling so violently that the metal chattered against the lock. The tremor was a phantom limb, a souvenir from Marcus, a constant, humming reminder of the fear he'd wired into her nervous system. Finally, the lock clicked open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent hall. As she nudged the door open with her shoulder, another door across the hall, 3A, opened with a faint, well-veiled whisper.
A man emerged.
He was tall, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and dark trousers that seemed far too expensive for a building like this. His black hair was impeccably styled, and his face was a mask of stoic indifference, all sharp angles and shadows. He didn't look at her, not directly, but she felt his awareness of her, a heavy, static presence in the air. He paused for a fraction of a second, his dark eyes sweeping over her tired scrubs, the pathetic box, and the tremor in her hands, before he continued down the hall towards the stairs, his footsteps making no sound on the worn linoleum. Chloe froze, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected neighbors to be so intense. There was a stillness about him, a coiled energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She watched until he disappeared, then quickly slipped inside her apartment, locking and bolting the door behind her with a final, desperate shove. The tiny one-bedroom apartment was bare, but the emptiness felt like a blessing, a clean slate where no ghosts could hide. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something other than terror. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it felt a little like hope. The first week was a blur of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Chloe worked double shifts at the downtown clinic, a grueling job that left her body aching but her mind blessedly numb. When she came home, she'd drag her feet up the 3 flights of stairs, her ears straining for any sound that was out of place. She learned the building's rhythms, the shouting matches from the couple on the second floor, the baby crying on the first, the scent of fried garlic that wafted up around dinner time. But apartment 3A remained a void of silence. Her neighbor, the man she had seen on her first day, was a ghost. She never heard a television, never heard music, never heard a voice. The only proof of his existence was the occasional glimpse of him leaving in the early morning or returning late at night. He moved with an unnerving grace, a predator's economy of motion. He always wore dark, tailored clothing and carried himself with an air of authority that felt dangerously out of place in their crumbling building. She learned his name was Minjun from a package left outside his door, the name printed in crisp, severe letters. The name felt as foreign and unknowable as the man himself. Chloe tried to build a sanctuary within her 4 walls. She bought a cheap, comfortable armchair from a thrift store and a small lamp that cast a warm, golden glow. She unpacked the photo of her mother and placed it on the rickety nightstand. These small acts of domesticity were her rebellion against the chaos Marcus had inflicted. Yet, fear was a stubborn stain. Every time a car backfired on the street below, her heart would hammer against her ribs. She would peek through the blinds, her mind conjuring images of his polished black sedan pulling up to the curb. She replayed his last words to her over and over, a venomous loop in her head. "You can't hide from me, Chloe. I will always find you." The memory was so vivid, she could almost feel the phantom pressure of his fingers on her arm. One evening, after a particularly brutal shift, she dropped her keys while trying to unlock her door. They skittered across the grimy floor, coming to rest near the door of 3A. As she bent to retrieve them, his door opened. Minjun stood there, holding a wastebasket. He looked down at her, then at the keys, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he just watched her, and in his dark, bottomless eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of cold, calculating assessment. The close call she'd been dreading came on a Tuesday. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, insidious violation that sent ice water through her veins. A bouquet of lilies, her favorite, the ones Marcus always bought after a fight, was delivered to the nurse's station at the clinic. There was no card, no sender's name, just the cloying, funereal scent that now made her stomach clench. He knew where she worked. The fragile sense of safety she had so carefully constructed shattered into a million pieces. The walk home that evening was a journey through a landscape of fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passerby was a potential spy. By the time she reached her apartment building, she was slick with a cold sweat, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't fit the key into the lock. A sob of pure frustration and terror escaped her lips. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the door, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to will the panic away. "Are you having trouble?" The voice was low and steady, startlingly close. She spun around to see Minjun standing a few feet away, his expression as impassive as ever. He held a sleek leather briefcase in one hand, but his attention was entirely on her. His gaze wasn't accusatory or impatient. It was intensely focused, taking in her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, the wild panic in her eyes. Chloe couldn't speak. She just shook her head, a pathetic, jerky motion. He took a step closer, and she flinched instinctively, pressing herself back against the door. A muscle in his jaw tightened, the only sign of any reaction. He didn't say another word. He simply reached out, his long, elegant fingers gently taking the keys from her grasp. He turned, inserted the key into the lock with one smooth, precise movement, and pushed her door open. He then placed the keys back into her palm, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. The contact was brief, but it sent a strange jolt through her, a warmth that was both unsettling and grounding. "You should be more careful," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with an unspoken weight. "This neighborhood is not for the careless." He then turned and entered his own apartment, the door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click, leaving her standing in the silence, the ghost of his touch still tingling on her skin. A few days later, her kitchen sink began to leak, a steady, rhythmic drip that echoed the frantic beating of her own heart. It started as a minor annoyance, but quickly escalated into a puddle that was slowly creeping across her cracked linoleum floor. She tried tightening the fittings with a wrench she'd found under the sink, but it only made the drip worse. The landlord, a gruff, disinterested man who only ever answered his phone to complain about late rent, was unreachable. Defeated and on the verge of tears, she stared at the growing pool of water. There was only one other option, and the thought of it made her deeply uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, she walked across the hall and knocked on the door to apartment 3A. It felt like crossing a line, voluntarily seeking out the unnerving stillness that emanated from the other side. The door opened almost immediately, as if he had been expecting her. Minjun stood there, wearing a simple gray Henley that did little to conceal the lean, powerful build of his frame. He raised a single eyebrow, his gaze questioning. "I'm so sorry to bother you," Chloe began, her voice small. "My sink. It's leaking. Everywhere." I didn't know who else to ask. He didn't respond right away, just studied her face for a long moment. She felt completely transparent under his scrutiny, as if he could see the fear and desperation she tried so hard to hide. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Show me." He followed her into her apartment, his presence immediately shrinking the small space. He moved with a deliberate silence, his eyes scanning the room, taking in her thrift store furniture and the single photo of her mother before settling on the disaster in her kitchen. Without a word, He knelt, his expensive-looking trousers brushing against the grimy, wet floor. He examined the pipes, his movements efficient and sure. He asked for her wrench, and when she handed it to him, he worked for several minutes in complete silence. The rhythmic dripping slowed, then stopped. He stood up, wiping his hands on a paper towel. "It's a temporary fix," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "The washer is corroded. You'll need to have it replaced, thank you," she breathed, relief washing over her. "I don't know what I would have done," he simply nodded, his eyes lingering on her for a second too long. "You should get a better deadbolt," he said, his gaze flicking to her door. "The one you have is insufficient." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, delivered with an authority that left no room for argument. And in that moment, Chloe realized his silence wasn't about indifference.
It was about observation.
He saw everything. The gestures started small, and they were deeply unsettling. 2 days after he fixed her sink, she came home from a long shift to find a heavy-duty, state-of-the-art deadbolt installed on her door. There was no note, no explanation. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was his doing. How had he done it without a key? The question was a dark whisper in the back of her mind. A week later, a heavy bag of groceries appeared outside her door. Not just staples, but fresh vegetables, good quality coffee, and a small container of the ginger tea she always drank at the clinic when she felt a cold coming on. It was thoughtful to the point of being terrifying. He was watching her. He knew her habits, her preferences. This wasn't neighborly, it was surveillance. The fear that had been her constant companion began to morph into something more complex. She felt safer, undeniably. The new lock clicked into place with a satisfying, heavy thud that her old one never had. But she also felt like a specimen under a microscope, her life being quietly observed and manipulated by the silent, powerful man across the hall. She had to confront him. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she waited until she saw him leaving his apartment one morning. "Min-jun," she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. He stopped, turning to face her. In the flat, unforgiving light of the hallway, he looked even more imposing. "The lock. The groceries," she said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Why?" His expression remained a carefully constructed blank slate. "The lock was a necessity. Your safety was compromised, and the groceries?" she pressed, her heart thudding. "You look tired." "Nurses forget to take care of themselves." His answers were simple, logical, and yet they explained nothing about the intensity of his actions. "I can't accept them," she said, though it felt like a lie. She was grateful, and that scared her more than anything. "I can take care of myself." For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something deeper, something that looked almost like disappointment. "Can you?" he asked, his voice soft but cutting. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent challenge passing between them, before he turned and walked down the stairs, leaving her alone with the heavy new lock on her door and the disquieting knowledge that she was under his protection, whether she wanted it or not. The illusion of safety, however compromised, was obliterated on a cold, rainy Thursday. Chloe was leaving the clinic, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her scrubs, when she saw him. Marcus. He was leaning against a lamppost across the street, the sickly orange glow of the light illuminating the cruel smirk on his face. He hadn't changed. The same expensive suit, the same perfectly coiffed hair, the same predatory stillness. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. The world tilted, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar in her ears. He saw her, and his smirk widened. He pushed himself off the lamppost and started walking towards her, his stride confident and unhurried. He was enjoying this. He was savoring her terror. Chloe's training kicked in, the fight-or-flight response a primal scream in her blood. She turned and ran, not towards the bus stop, but back into the labyrinthine streets of the city. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. She could hear his footsteps behind her, steady and relentless. He wasn't running, he was stalking her. She ducked into a crowded alleyway, pressing herself into the shadows behind a dumpster, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. She could smell the rot of garbage and stale rain, a scent she would forever associate with pure panic. She waited, her muscles screaming with tension, until the sound of his footsteps faded. Shaking, she made her way home through a circuitous route, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. She finally stumbled up the stairs to her apartment, her hands so slick with sweat she could barely hold her keys. As she reached her landing, she saw a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the hall, near the stairwell. Her heart stopped. It was him. It was Marcus. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized it wasn't Marcus. It was Minjun. He was just standing there, watching her. And then she saw it. Just past his shoulder, at the top of the stairs, was Marcus, his face contorted in a mask of rage. He had followed her. He had cornered her. Before she could even scream, Minjun moved. It wasn't a frantic rush, but a fluid, terrifyingly calm motion. He stepped forward, positioning himself squarely between her and Marcus. "This is a private matter," Marcus snarled, trying to peer around Minjun's broad shoulders. Minjun didn't even look at him. His eyes were fixed on Chloe, on her pale, terrified face. "She is no longer your matter," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a register so low and cold it was barely human. "You will leave this building now. And you will not return," Marcus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who are you to tell me what to do?" Minjun finally turned his head slowly to look at Marcus. He said nothing else. He simply held the man's gaze. Chloe couldn't see his expression, but she saw the effect it had on Marcus. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by a confusion that quickly curdled into genuine fear. Marcus took an involuntary step back, then another, before turning and scrambling down the stairs like a frightened animal. Minjun stood perfectly still until the sound of his fleeing footsteps was gone, the silence of the hallway rushing back in to fill the void. After Marcus fled, the adrenaline that had been keeping Chloe upright deserted her, and her legs gave out. She slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. The hallway seemed to swim around her. Minjun was at her side in an instant, kneeling in front of her. His face, which had been a mask of cold fury moments before, was now etched with a concern so profound it startled her. He reached out as if to touch her, then seemed to think better of it, his hand hovering in the air between them. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm with command. "You are not safe here." He helped her to her feet, his grip on her arm steady and surprisingly gentle. He didn't lead her to her own apartment, but to his. He unlocked the door to 3A and guided her inside. The contrast to the rest of the building was jarring. His apartment was spacious, minimalist, and immaculate. The furniture was sparse but expensive, a low-slung leather sofa, a glass coffee table, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of the city skyline. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no clutter. It felt less like a home and more like a corporate suite or a meticulously curated fortress. He led her to the sofa and had her sit down before disappearing into another room, returning a moment later with a glass of water and a thick cashmere blanket, which he draped over her shoulders. The warmth and weight of it were immediately comforting. Chloe wrapped it around herself, still shaking. She looked up at him as he stood before her, a dark, silent sentinel against the glittering city lights. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question she had been afraid to ask for weeks. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant as he looked out the window. "I am a man who solves problems," he said finally, his voice heavy with unspoken history. "The man you are running from, Marcus Thorne. His father's company has business dealings that are of interest to my associates. I've been aware of him, and of his violent tendencies. For some time, the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't chosen this building by chance. You knew," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and dawning anger. "You knew who I was. You knew he was looking for me." "Yes," he admitted, turning to face her fully. There was no apology in his eyes, only a stark, unyielding resolve. "When you moved in, I recognized your name from the files we keep on Thorne's associates. I did not anticipate he would find you so quickly. That was my mistake. He was a criminal. A gangster. The realization should have sent her running, but she was too exhausted, too terrified of the danger outside his door to move. He was dangerous, but he had just saved her. She was caught between two terrifying worlds. What kind of problems do you solve, Minjun? She asked, needing to hear it. He met her gaze, his own dark and fathomless. The kind that do not come back, he said, and the chilling finality in his tone left no doubt about what he meant. The next 48 hours were a strange, suspended reality. Chloe stayed in Minjun's apartment, a willing prisoner in his sterile fortress. He gave her the guest room, a space as immaculate and impersonal as the rest of the apartment, and left her to her own devices. She slept a deep, dreamless sleep of pure emotional and physical exhaustion. When she was awake, she would sit by the vast window, wrapped in his cashmere blanket, watching the city breathe below. The world outside felt distant and unreal. The only reality was the quiet, tense space she now shared with this dangerous, enigmatic man. He was a constant, silent presence. He would bring her food, simple, nourishing meals that appeared on a tray outside her door, and fresh clothes, a plain gray sweatsuit that was soft and ridiculously large on her. He spoke little, but his watchfulness never wavered. He was giving her space to recover, but he was also guarding her. The threat from Marcus was gone, but the larger threat of Minjun's world now loomed over everything. On the third day, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, he finally came to her. He didn't speak, just stood in the doorway of the guest room, watching her. Chloe turned from the window to face him. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now mingled with a reluctant, terrifying sense of gratitude. "He won't bother you again," Minjun said, breaking the silence. It wasn't a reassurance, it was a statement of fact. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He walked over to the window, standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching. He stared out at the sprawling city lights, a kingdom he seemed to command from his perch. "I made it clear to his father that his son's behavior was creating a business liability," he explained, his voice devoid of emotion. "Marcus Thorne has been sent away. A very long, very distant trip from which he is unlikely to return. He had erased him from her life with a single, quiet command. The sheer power of it was staggering. It was more terrifying than any physical violence. She should have been horrified, but all she could feel was a profound, overwhelming wave of relief. The monster that had haunted her for over a year was gone. For good. She started to cry, not the hysterical sobs of panic, but quiet, cleansing tears of release. She wept for the life she had lost, for the fear she had lived with, and for the complicated, frightening man who had finally set her free. Minjun remained silent, but he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding, a solid anchor in the storm of her emotions. And in that moment, Chloe knew that her life was irrevocably entangled with his. The confrontation she had been dreading arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, deadly stillness. A week after Marcus's disappearance, Chloe was just starting to feel the tendrils of a normal life begin to regrow. She was still staying in Minjun's apartment, a silent arrangement that neither of them had questioned. One evening, there was a sharp, insistent knock on the door. Minjun, who had been reading in a chair across the room, looked up, his body instantly alert. He held up a hand, signaling for her to stay quiet, and moved silently to the door. He peered through the peephole, and a muscle in his jaw clenched. He turned to her, his eyes dark with a seriousness she had never seen before. "Go to the guest room," he ordered in a low voice. "Lock the door. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. Before she could protest, he was opening the main door. She caught a glimpse of two large, menacing men in dark suits before she scurried to the guest room, her hands shaking as she turned the lock. The walls were thick, but she could hear the low murmur of voices. One was Minjun's, calm and controlled. The others were aggressive, guttural. The conversation grew heated. There was a sudden, sharp thud, followed by a grunt of pain. Chloe pressed her ear to the door, her heart hammering. She heard the unmistakable sound of a struggle, shuffling feet, another heavy impact, a choked cry. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying. This was his world. This was the violence that lurked just beneath his calm, controlled surface. The fight was brutally short. A final, sickening crack echoed through the apartment, followed by a profound silence. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. Chloe held her breath, every nerve screaming. Was he hurt? Was he? The lock on her door clicked. She scrambled back as the door swung open. Minjun stood there, his chest rising and falling heavily. His black shirt was slightly disheveled, and there was a fresh cut bleeding freely above his eyebrow. But he was alive. He was standing. Behind him, in the living room, the two men were unconscious on the floor, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles. Minjun's gaze found hers, and the cold, hard mask of the killer softened ever so slightly. He saw the terror on her face. "It's over," he said, his voice strained. He walked toward her, and she didn't flinch. She met him halfway, her nurse's instincts overriding her fear. She reached up with a trembling hand and gently touched the cut on his forehead. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He closed his eyes at her touch, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features for the first time. In that moment, the lines blurred. He wasn't just a gangster or a protector. He was a man, wounded and bleeding, and she was the one who could heal him. The months that followed were a slow, careful dance of healing. The immediate threat was gone, neutralized by Minjun's ruthless efficiency, but the emotional scars remained. Chloe moved back into her own apartment, but the door between 3A and 3B was rarely closed. They fell into a quiet routine. She would patch him up after his business meetings, her nurse's hand steady as she cleaned cuts and bandaged bruised knuckles, never asking for details. In return, he provided a profound sense of security she had never known. He was the silent guardian in the night, the unbreachable wall between her and the world's dangers. Their conversations were sparse at first, but gradually deepened. She told him about her mother, about her dream of working in pediatric oncology, about the simple life she had craved before Marcus had turned it into a nightmare. He listened, his focus absolute, absorbing every detail. He, in turn, began to open up, sharing fragments of his own past. He spoke of a childhood in Seoul, of a family debt that had forced him into this life, of a promise he had made to his own mother to protect the innocent wherever he could. He was a man trapped by honor and obligation, wielding immense power but finding no joy in it. "You bring quiet to my life," he confessed one night, as they sat on his sofa, the city lights twinkling below them like a fallen constellation. "Before you, there was only noise. The demands, the violence. With you, it is still." Chloe felt a warmth spread through her chest. She, who had felt so broken and powerless, was a source of peace for this powerful, tormented man. She had spent so long being the one who needed protection, she hadn't realized she was capable of offering it in her own way. Their relationship was built not on whispered sweet nothings, but on shared silence, on mutual understanding, on the quiet comfort of presence. A touch of his hand on her arm was more intimate than a kiss. A look from him held more meaning than 1,000 words. He showed her a side of himself no one else saw, the man who enjoyed the simple pleasure of the ginger tea she made for him, who would sometimes watch old black-and-white movies with a rare, small smile on his face. She, in turn, stopped flinching at shadows. The tremors in her hands lessened. She started to laugh again, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, and she was slowly, carefully, learning to live again, all under the watchful, protective gaze of the Korean Mafia boss next door. He had saved her from her past, and in doing so, she was unknowingly saving him from his present.